Stephen Phelps is our speaker today, and we're very, very delighted to have him available to speak about the writings of the Báb to us. He received a dual bachelor's degree in physics and in philosophy from Stanford University and a Ph.D. in physics from Princeton University, specializing in cosmology. So you would think with all of his knowledge of Arabic and Persian that he had studied those languages in school, but in actual fact, he picked that up later on when he was serving in Haifa. He served at the World Center for 13 years in the research department, and he was responsible there for coordinating the indexing and collation of Bahá'í Sacred Writings and their translations from Persian and Arabic into English. During that time also, he held a concurrent position in the physics department at the Technion University in Haifa, where he published original research on the masses of nearby galaxies. So he did indeed continue his physics work while he was there in Haifa. Currently, he is in Portland, Oregon, where he, his wife, and his 3 daughters reside. Thanks, Steve, for being with us today. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody. I'm going to be giving today an introduction to the writings of the Báb, not certainly from the perspective of an expert who has read all the writings of the Báb, but from the perspective of an interested student who will attempt to lead you through one way that I have taken in pulling together what is available of these writings and trying to understand them in their historical and spiritual context. I'm going to begin by asking, the question, who was the Báb? Why are we interested in studying the Báb's writings? And then look at some challenges along the path of approach to reading his writings, and then address these challenges by introducing some aids to their study. I'll be making this PowerPoint available at the end, as well as the aids to study that I've created. So the first question, or the first observation that I want to make is something which really being born and raised in a Baha'i family didn't strike me as, doesn't always strike one as odd, but the fact that there are twin prophets, that there are 2 separate individuals in nearly one historical moment who come with a prophetically inspired message. And these 2 messages, although consonant in their aims and complementary in their content, are nevertheless are different from each other. They have differences relating to the style and relating to their content. How are we to understand the differences between these, and how can we understand the Báb in his relationship to Baha'u'llah? The simplest narrative that we have, and one that it's really a simplifying narrative, is to think of the Báb primarily as a forerunner, almost a John the Baptist-like figure to Baha'u'llah, who prepares the way. And in this view of the Báb and his writings, it's mainly of historical interest, what he said and what he did. Even words of the Báb himself might be taken in support of this, where he says 1,000 perusals of the Bayan cannot equal the perusal of a single verse to be revealed by him whom God should make manifest. But the other side of the same coin is that the Báb also comes as representing an independent prophetic event, which is complementary, though not identical, to the message of Baha'u'llah, and that his message is of continuing relevance for today. In understanding the position of the Báb relative to Baha'u'llah in the Baha'i faith, we have, fortunately, core texts which probably many people on this webinar already are familiar with. The 2 primarily that offer us historical context being the Dawnbreakers the early history of the Bahá'í faith that was commissioned and approved by Baha'u'llah, and the first 5 chapters of God Passes By, written by Shoghi Effendi, which largely, though not entirely, summarizes the contents of the Dawnbreakers. And this gives us a historical context for the writings of the Báb. The theological context to understand the position of the Báb in relation to Baha'u'llah, I think, comes primarily through, again, Shoghi Effendi's letter, The Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, in the paragraphs that he devotes to the dispensation of the Báb. And one thing that he says here, which is, I think, a good place to start in framing our exploration of the Báb's writings, comes in this letter, where he says that the greatness of the Báb consists, welcome Rob, by the way, that the greatness of the Báb consists primarily not in his being the divinely appointed forerunner of so transcendent a revelation, but rather in his having been invested with the powers inherent in the inaugurator of a separate religious dispensation, and in his wielding to a degree unrivaled by the messengers gone before him the scepter of independent prophethood. There can be no doubt that the claim to the twofold station ordained for the Báb by the Almighty, a claim which he himself has so boldly advanced, which Baha'u'llah has repeatedly affirmed, and to which the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha has finally given the sanction of its testimony, constitutes the most distinctive feature of the Baha'i dispensation. But being so motivated then to look into the revelation of the Báb and to understand it on its own terms as an independent example of this prophetic calling that appears in the world, we are faced with several challenges, and I will deal with and address 2 of these challenges. The first challenge is that of access, and that is that the original texts and translations are scattered in various places. They're not pulled together in one place within the covers of one book for us to read it in a single sitting or across several sittings. The task of just getting one's head around what's out there is really Herculean, and which is emphasized by what we know of the size of what the Báb has left, which is surprisingly comparable to the size of the entire revelation of Baha'u'llah, which over the course of Baha'u'llah's 40-year ministry, he left us approximately 6 million words in around 20,000 surviving works, from very small letters and prayers to the largest works like his Book of Certitude. The Báb, in his comparatively shorter ministry of 6 years, left us 5 million words and around 2,000 surviving works. And this, the source of this is here at this through this hyperlink. It's really amazing to just pause on that, on those statistics, that in the course of 6 years, the Báb revealed works almost equal in their extent and size to what Baha'u'llah revealed in 40 years. That also means, of course, that the average length of a work of the Báb, since only 2,000 surviving works are left to us, the average length of a work of the Báb is around 10 times longer than the average length of a work of Baha'u'llah. These works are mainly left to us in Arabic, over 90%, with the remainder in Persian. And the vast majority are untranslated. If we look at the single volume of authorized translations that we have, Selections for the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, which at around 55,000 words, and compare that to the 5 million or so words that the Báb left us, that's somewhere closer to 1% really of the writings of the Báb that we have in authorized translation. Of course, that leaves the many provisional translations which have been attempted over the years, and which it will be in part the project that I'll describe to pull these provisional translations together and to bring them in some sort of an order. So the first problem in approaching the study of the Báb's writings is access, and the second is context. We're faced with a vast body of work which is left to us in a quite, for those of us in the West, a quite unfamiliar, even alien cultural context that assumes intimate familiarity with the Quran and with Shiite Islamic thought. It's also written to us in ways that may seem to us to be almost purposefully obscure. The use of the abjad system, which assigns numerical values to letters, the extensive use of these numerical values as signifiers of meaning in the Báb's writings, sometimes to the extent of the number of verses in certain chapters is a numerical value which translates to a certain word which has meaning. This adds layers of difficulty in understanding the Báb's writings. The Báb uses language in innovative ways. There's a great deal of grammatical innovation in form, which lead us, I think, to suspect that what the Báb is doing with language is not simply what other people do with language, not so much delivering words to convey facts about things, but rather delivering words to paint a kind of a picture, to invite us into a different kind of aesthetic space. The subject matter of that the Báb addresses also can be quite obscure to our Western ears. So let's try to address each of these challenges in turn to the limited extent that we can at this stage. And the first thing I'll do is address this question of access. Although around 1% of the Báb's writings have been translated, and the rest in the original Arabic and Persian are, to all intents and purposes, scattered in various places across various manuscript libraries. And I'm not addressing the question of the manuscripts that are available at the World Center because those are not in practice available to us. And so I'm only dealing with those texts and manuscripts and sources which are available somewhere in the public domain. And so what I will attempt to do is create an index of what is available in the public domain. And then on the basis of these available texts, try to suggest some kind of a content roadmap that can help us build an orienting framework to these writings. So the first thing I'll do is look at approaching creating an inventory of the Báb's writings. And the first place we can look at is what are some existing lists of the Báb's writings. This would certainly be a starting point, and any inventory we end up with should include all of these items at the very least. So Shoghi Effendi left us, for example, in the old Bahá'í World volumes, a list of best-known works of the central figures. There are 23 items on his list of best-known works of the Báb. There are a few others that have been published in other sources that have lists of somewhat longer in some cases. All of these are useful starting points for us. In the case of Nader Saidi's Gate of the Heart, he introduces some 27 items, most of which are also in the best known works list, but also summarizes us, gives us short abstracts of each of those, which can be quite useful. This is Shoghi Effendi's list of the Báb's best known works. And again, for us, just looking at the list, they're just words. I mean, these are just names, titles, no context, no understanding of what's in them. So it's our task to at least use these as a starting point, perhaps, as a because we know that these are probably going to be more important than the other ones, and we'll be highlighting these in the indexing work that we do. So the starting point then is to take an inventory, and we want to collate all the available texts. And I'll show you briefly, although I don't want to get too technical, but I just want to show you how this can be done. This isn't magic, but it just requires a lot of time and patience. One basically starts with a spreadsheet and starts accounting for these sources in the rows and columns of the spreadsheet. Let me actually switch over to a spreadsheet view. Rob, everyone can see this, right? I'm assuming that everyone can see this since I'm sharing my screen and not just the app. So you start with the idea is to give an example of how you would start, say, with a book that everyone has access to, which is Selections for the Writings of the Báb. And how would one start? Create an index of the Báb's writings with this as a starting point. Well, you have a number of tablets and selections of the writings of the Báb. You can, and that work in English can occupy one column, and each of the unique tablets in that work can occupy a unique row. We also have a Persian version of Selections of the Writings of the Báb, which has its own pagination, and so we create another column for the Persian edition of Selections for the Writings of the Báb. And then we create a list of all of the tablets that are in that volume, and just type out the first lines. Sometimes, for instance, with the Qayyum al-Asma or other works, there are multiple extracts from a given longer work, and in those cases, you just give it multiple entries in your spreadsheet. So what you have here is just really a table of contents or index to Selections of the Writings of the Báb, where you have the first lines and you have the page count, the page numbering, both in the original English and in the Arabic and Persian. What you can do next then is create other additional columns that give additional information on these. So one column can be the first line if you have access to a first line. Another column can be let me unhide this and hide these for the moment. If you have an invocation, you can include the invocation. If you have any more information about these, for instance, the word counts, which you can either estimate if you only have access to manuscripts, or if you have electronic text, you can actually count them out. And then if you have a title, you can put the title. So you can see this sort of already growing, and this is just a single volume. The next step then is to take all of the other possible sources that one has access to and just simply add more columns. And as you add more columns, sometimes you'll find that you're recording a tablet which you already have a row for, in which case the column and the rows intersect. So unhiding this and showing, for example, you can then look at the manuscripts from the Iranian National Baha'i Archives, digital images of which are available at the Afnan Library online. And for each of these manuscripts, you'd create a column, and each one of the manuscripts, and let's see if I can, there's some, well, some of the buttons I need to press are being covered up by other buttons now. Basically, what you end up with is all the rows will represent a unique tablet, and all the columns will represent a unique manuscript source. And one fills in the word counts, one fills in the titles and descriptions, and you end up with a complete sort of indexed accounting of everything that one can find, mostly online or in manuscript libraries that are associated with institutions, national libraries, university libraries, and so forth. It turns out that the main manuscript sources for the writings of the Báb are Cambridge University, the Iranian National Baha'i Archives, which is available, as I mentioned, on the Afnan Library, the Princeton Library, the British Library. I have a list here in another slide or two. One benefit of using this spreadsheet method is that a spreadsheet sort of gives you a superpower, and the superpower is you can sort the spreadsheet on any of the columns. And when you do that, when you sort the spreadsheet on columns, it enables you to sort of instantly create a table of context for these, a table of contents for a particular volume, or in the case of, say, if you sort on word count, you now have in descending order a list of all of the major works of the Báb in descending order. So this then enables you to very quickly access works of different, for instance, if you just want to see all the longest works, you can see those pretty much instantaneously. Then this, not necessarily human readable form, you can then translate into a Word document through a suitable series of macros and then create a catalog from that. So that's probably more than enough technical detail on how one can make such an index. But what one ends up with, and I'll show you the result of this, is a human readable catalog from the spreadsheet that you can start using to as a launch point then for your deeper investigation of the Báb's writings. And I have a URL to the existing catalog here, and which will be available after the talk. So as I mentioned, the main sources for this are the Iranian National Baha'i Archives volumes in the Afnan Library, these various university and national collections, some of which images are just freely available online. Princeton University is an example where you just go to the URL and you have pages from manuscripts, miscellaneous publications, and miscellaneous websites. This is a screen grab from from our primary source, the most important single source for the Báb's writings in the original languages available outside the World Center, which is the Afnan Library images of the INBA volumes. So, and then the English translations, of course, add into this. So this is not just an index of the original Arabic and Persian manuscripts, but you include all of the translations as well. Each translated text, as I actually started with, Selections of the Writings of the Báb, got its own column. The fragments that Shoghi Effendi has translated in his various works, such as the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah and God Passes By, are included, as well as the many provisional translations which can be found in Nader Saidi's book, Gate of the Heart, in A Most Noble Pattern, which is published through George Ronald, and through other websites. Stephen Lambden's website deserves special mention as a kind of Aladdin's cave of dozens and dozens of some partially finished and many fascinating notes and translations of more obscure works of the Báb, and all of these are included in the index. And from this index, one then compares it to the known numbers, which are 5 million words and 2,000 works, and we find that we can pull around 30% of that total found in the public domain in the original languages. So just to give you a brief look at this, and again, this will be made available after the webinar. The inventory includes for each item then, and I should mention that after exerting this spreadsheet superpower and organizing everything in descending order of length, one very useful thing that one can do then, because one wants to be able to access these and identify them, one thing one can do is then identify or assign an ID number to each of these tablets. And the ID numbers that I assigned are in ascending order, or ascending order in terms of word count. So BB1 is the longest work that we have of the Báb, which is his Kitabi Asma. BB2 is his Qaim al-Asmar, his commentary on the Surah of Joseph, and going all the way down to the total number, which I found, which I think was 645 tablets that could be found. So for each of those, there's this BB number, and there's then a summary of all of the manuscript sources for that, as well as where it might have been published in the original text, as well as, of particular interest for this webinar, what has been translated. What are the extracts from these works that have been translated? And these are all selections of writings of the Báb. So this uses a shorthand of codes, and each code refers to a particular source. And so if we go through the various pages of this index to the next section, then we find a key to the source codes, so you know what all of these 3- and 4-letter codes mean. And wherever I was able to find it, I include a hypertext link to hopefully a digital image of that source, if not at least an index entry from an institutional library. So that's the key to the source codes is part of this. And then finding is following this is a finding aid where all of the each of the references then is put in an index in alphabetical order, so you can effectively see tables of contents of all of the sources. So so going back to selections from writings of the Báb, or even Gate of the Heart, you see on almost every page of Gate of the Heart there is either a reference to a work of the Báb or a translated extract from a tablet of the Báb. And you can be reading Gate of the Heart, come across a tablet that you're interested in, look it up on this list, and then through the index number, immediately go to the catalog entry and see, well, is there anything else translated on this tablet? If I have some knowledge of the original language, can I access the original text through and then maybe compare the original to the translation. So this enables you to do that. And then next in the finding aids is a list of titles alphabetically ordered with the link to the index numbers. And these titles, the blue ones are the ones that are found in Shoghi Effendi's list of best known works. So these are the standout titles, and then the others are either unofficial titles or just brief descriptions. This set here are the set of 20 tablets in the opening pages of the Dawnbreakers, which are the letters of the Báb to the tablets of the Báb to the letters of the living. So each of them, of course, has its own index entry and can be accessed here, and a few of them are translated. Then there's an index of first line. So if, and this is again primarily for students of the original languages, if one has a tablet which they think is by the Báb and they have the first line of it, then they can refer to this alphabetized index of first lines and quickly find if this is a tablet that's at least in this catalog. Of course, this catalog, for all its apparent completeness, only includes somewhat less than 1/3 of the total of the works that the Báb revealed. The final finding aid brings us to I think what might be a useful starting point for those who want to take their own journey through what is available in English of the Báb's writings. And I'm going to come back to this as soon as I look at this, as soon as we look at the next slide. So having pulled together the content and we have everything kind of lined up from A to Z, and we have access to whatever we could have access to. The next question before we jump in and try to read through it is say, well, how can we establish a broader context? And I would recommend, and I've over the last couple of weeks listened to Todd Lawson's webinars that he delivered over the last few months, and those are really wonderful. And one thing he says there, which I think can't be overemphasized, is the best way to establish context for understanding the writings of the Báb is to read the Quran and understand the Quran, because so much of what he does and says is through that lens. So much of the language he uses, so much of the allusions he makes are Quranic allusions, and the more one is familiar with that text, the less of an alien territory the Báb's writings will be. I also personally would recommend to get the broader context, to get a copy if you can, or borrow a copy, and because this is a very difficult book, read the whole book if you can, but at least read the introduction to Nader Sayyedi's Gate of the Heart, which is I find extremely well written and positions the writings of the Báb in the context of the modern age, and positions them especially as regards the relevance of what the Báb had to say for the problems of the present day. It's, I think, very well written and it deserves a look. For the specific context, of course, read whatever we have in the Dawnbreakers and God Passes By, and the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah. And Also, and this is what I've done because partly there's no other competing periodizations out there. But one thing that Nader Saidi has done in Gate of the Heart is periodize the Báb's revelation into three periods, an early, a middle, and a late period. The early period in Shiraz, 1844 to 1846, including early Esfahan, where the Báb's writings tended to focus more in an interpretive sort of a mode. Here they were tied most closely to the Islamic context. And in the middle period, 1846 to 1847, when the Báb was in Esfahan, it turns to more philosophical questions, metaphysical questions. In the later period, Makhu and Chehrik, it takes more of a legislative focus. The break from Islam is more complete, and there's an increasing emphasis on the imminent arrival of he whom God shall make manifest. As with any sort of periodization or any sort of attempt to summarize, is that one leaves out more than one includes. But the idea is that one wants some kind of a roadmap to make it through this uncharted continent, and this is one way of approaching it. Using this periodization as a roadmap, the idea that there is an evolution in the Báb's writings, an evolution in themes. Why don't we then pull what we can of what's available in the translations and then arrange it according to this periodization? And that's what the last finding aid in this index does, is it takes period by period, starting with the early period, and only lists out those catalog entries for which there is some kind of English translation available. It might be a full translation, provisional, or authorized. More likely, it's going to be a fragmentary provisional translation, kind of what we've got, the best that we've got at this time. And within each period, I don't tend to know the dates. If I know something about when something was revealed relative to something else, based on what's out in the published literature, then I've organized it in that way. Otherwise, one should take the ordering within each period as being more as being somewhat random. So this is a semi-chronological list of the English translations, and one could go through each of these, starting with these early works of the Báb, and of course early on one finds the Qayyim al-Asma and the various fragments of that are available to us, and one can read one's way through if one wanted, and get some sense of the movement of topics throughout the Báb's revelation, throughout his ministry. Of course, some number of these texts, the period is unknown, and most of these are from selections of writings of the Báb, and so those come at the end. So in terms of well, what is there to be found? What are the themes to be found? And I made a list just as suggestively. It appears to me that one can find within the Báb's writings striking and sometimes subversive and sometimes revolutionary ideas that I have not seen in Baha'u'llah's writings, that touch on some major themes in philosophy and theology throughout the history of thought, particularly the history of thought in the West. There's metaphysical themes in the Báb's writings on metaphysical unity, on the causation of the divine, on whether God can even be regarded as an object, and what that does to our conception of the divine when it transcends the concept of being an object. Epistemologically, there are themes on the limits of reason and means of accessing deeper knowledge. There are insights in hermeneutics, or the science of interpretation, either implicitly or explicitly. The Báb has written treatises on grammar and the meaning of grammar, and his writings have so much symbolic content. They give us a sense of interplay of form and content in language. The Báb oftentimes the form of his works will echo in some way the content of the works. Sometimes he'll write out his own tablets in the shapes of haikals or five-pointed stars as a representation of the frame of the human body, and that's a layer of meaning which is in addition to the content of the tablet itself. As I mentioned, he uses abjad numbering sometimes to add and layer on additional meanings. Sometimes he'll take in what I think what I believe Todd Lawson has coined the term exploded commentary. He'll take shorter surahs of the Quran and explode them out into their individual words and letters, and then write a commentary as an entire chapter on individual words or letters. What is the Báb doing with the language when he does that? What does that tell us about keys to how one interprets something like a work of divine revelation, when what the Báb is doing with it is not what normal people, what people normally do with language. The Báb also has great insights in the ethical realm, the nature of right action and the motives for right action, the relationship between free will and destiny and predestination. And last but certainly not least, there are, I think, incredible contributions in the aesthetic realm with the Báb's focus on beauty and refinement as governing principles, not just of his revelation, but of our life in the world. And the idea of everything having a potential degree of perfection, which one is morally obligated to assist it in reaching. All of these are aspects of the Báb's writings, and what I've done, and I doubt we're going to have time, and I may be over time already, but what I've done in the remaining slides, which I'll just make available for you to look at, perhaps in your own time. For each of these ideas or overarching themes, I've created, I've included some brief quotation that touches upon that might give you some idea that there are some very deep and unique things here in the Báb's writings. And a lot of these you'll see are from Gate of the Heart, because Nader Saidi has done such a great job of mapping out for us some of these unexplored reaches of the Báb's writings, and has been a real pioneer in exposing for us some of these depths. So that's pretty much all I had to present on. And just to summarize, the issues that we're dealing with at this very early stage in understanding the Báb's writings are issues of getting access, just having everything together, piled proverbially or metaphorically on the table in front of us, so that we can start going through it systematically. That's our first problem, and hopefully the catalog that I've made in connection with this can help with that access problem. And the second issue is out of context, and that's, there are no shortcuts, I think, in getting one's head around the context to better understand what the Báb is saying. There's no shortcut to reading the Quran and reading the Dawnbreakers before or in parallel to one's journey through these various through this strange and exotic and wonderful territory of the Báb's revelation. So that's probably as good a point as any to pause and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Steve. My mind is blown. This is really quite amazing, and we are extremely grateful that you have offered this survey of the writings of the Báb to the world today through our web talk. I apologize, my computer crashed. I've never had it crash before. Actually, in the year, my computer actually crashed. That's why I disappeared. I have a bunch of questions before we get to everyone else's questions, which I assume will multiply. Mm-hmm. We have about 1/3 of the works, 30% of the works of the Báb available in public sources. My guess is that of those 5 million words, we have a lot more than 30% of the 5 million words. Have you any sense of the...
No, it's around the same. The proportion is around the same. I did the word count briefly. Well, one can do it. I'm not sure I have all the items here, but another superpower of these spreadsheets is especially if it's in numerical form, you can just sort of, you can sum everything up. And this isn't everything, though, but it was something like 1.5 million, I think. There's 775,000 here. It ended up, I think, being about 1.5 million in this partial catalog of, 645 items. So it tracks roughly the 1/3 number or 30% number.
I assume all of the 23 works the Guardian singled out are on this list.
Of course.
Yeah, so all of them are available in public domain or whatever Persian, Arabic.
Yes. All of those, for all of the items in Shoghi Effendi's list, there is one or more texts in the original, which is available in the public domain. And for most of these, there's at least some extract translation. So some of these are their entire provisional translations of the Arabic Bayan. I don't know how many people know there's a full English translation of a French translation of the Arabic Bayan, which was done
Nicolas.
By Nicolas in 1905, and this provisional translation was done by Peter Terry, I think, in 1980. And so under the catalog entry for the Arabic Bayan, there's a link to that to that translation, for example.
What are some of the lengthy works that we don't have in public form? Are we talking about, for example, the Quran commentaries that the Báb wrote, some of which we supposedly have disappeared?
Yeah, that we know of, because this is mentioned in the Dawnbreakers, that the Báb revealed a number of full-length commentaries on the Quran, which have never entered the public domain. So we can't say anything about those in connection to this project.
Right. And a question that I received by email yesterday, I believe it was, someone wrote the Wilman Institute wanting to know what the Báb's social teachings were. And I've been wanting to write back to the person and say, you were asking the wrong question. But perhaps you can elaborate on that. Say, well, equality of men and women, they listen. Well, I'm not sure I would say the Báb taught that, but clearly with Tahirih, there was something implied.
Yes.
How would you answer that question?
That's a great starting point. I mean, with the unveiling of Tahirih in such a in such a dramatic fashion, that was one of the most eloquent possible proclamations of that social principle, which has become so central in top of the list in the Baha'i in the Baha'i faith. And I have not seen anyone attempt to list them out, but I agree with you that it's kind of the wrong question to ask, because in a way the Báb himself, although his Persian Bayan and Arabic Bayan are filled with laws and ordinances and do's and don'ts, there's a sense in which even the Báb understood that his doing so had a different kind of a purpose. Then even the Báb knew that the coming of he whom God shall make manifest was imminent, and that Baha'u'llah would take what he wanted, from the writings of the Báb, and implement that, in his faith. It's almost as though the Báb was presented to he whom God should make manifest, so that he wouldn't have to do as much work, right. so that Baha'u'llah could just pick the ones that were needed and relevant and in accordance with the exigencies of the age, and activate those in the Kitabi Akdas. One could certainly list out hundreds, and looking at both the full provisional translation of the Arabic Bayan, which we do have, as well as E.G. Brown's summary translation of the Persian Bayan, which we also have access to. One can answer that question for oneself by looking at those texts.
Yeah, my impression, even with the writings of Baha'u'llah, is that there's a certain unfolding of the revelation, with the social teachings being near the end, basically. I mean, you can go through the hidden words, and you can certainly find, there's to be no racism, just in, why have we created you all from the same dust?
Yes.
But you have to imply, you have to tease out of the earliest revelations, the nuclei of the things that are elaborated upon later. And it seems to me the Báb has done, in some ways, the same thing, but a stage earlier.
Yes.
Talking about the concept of God, of manifestations, of truth, of the nature of the soul, of the spiritual journey, and that Baha'u'llah begins his ministry by reiterating these themes, expanding upon them, connecting them to Christianity and the Quran, of course, but then gradually builds on these things as you get later on in Baha'u'llah's revelations. You could argue that it's very difficult to argue, it's even difficult to say that equality of men and women is a teaching by Baha'u'llah, because he doesn't say it explicitly, but he implies it three or four different ways when he talks about women being able to work, he talks about women being able to make a decision who they're going to marry instead of having their parents choose it. You can multiply these different instances and argue that Abdu'l-Baha is the one who pulled it all together. Anyway, I don't want to take too much.
Yes, I mean, even with Baha'u'llah's, if one were, for example, to look at Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i Iqan, such a central work, and ask, where's the principle of, say, the oneness of humanity in the Kitab-i Iqan? One would be hard-pressed to find it. But to say that is not to make an argument about anything in particular, except that the social teachings are progressively unfolded throughout the ministries of each of the central figures. And I think one thing that, to me, that points up is it tends to work against a kind of thinking that that all the do's and don'ts are revealed up front, and then our job is simply to follow the instruction book.
Right.
And that's not how I understand things unfolding, especially with the role of the House of Justice as having this incredible power to enact legislation in accordance with the needs of the age. There's a flexibility which in the whole system, which is built in, which keeps it from being ossified, which keeps it from being too restrictive and constrictive at the beginning. And we see this evolution in social teachings throughout the ministries of the central figures, but beyond that, we also see this gradual application of the principles which themselves are unchanging. The principle of love is the one unchanging thing, Baha'u'llah says in one of his tablets. He says everything changes, all the laws and ordinances change, except for the law of love, which like a fountain is ever renewed and never ceases flowing. And I think that's the more of the perspective we have as Baha'is, is that the whole thing is a flexible framework. And to the extent there are laws and ordinances laid down, they're very few in number, really.
Yeah, and I think you can even argue that people like to think of Shoghi Effendi as the primary organizer of the administration, but if you look at the Advent of Divine Justice, those three principles of success are spiritual principles, are mystic principles, a chaste and holy life, freedom from prejudice, and an upright character. These go all the way back to the hidden words. The guardian is a mystic. He lays those principles out. He brings us right back to the basic nature of religion in the Advent of Divine Justice. And we don't like to think of the guardian as, in a sense, commenting on a mystic text or an ethical text, but he is. Anyway, we have some more questions here, and I certainly don't want to take too much time. Keenan asks, do we know what portion of the works are in the library in Haifa? And I guess the answer is 100% of it.
100%. Yeah. Well, not 100%. I mean, there are scattered items which are still presumably in private hands, either in Iran or throughout the world. Things always come in over time. Things are always discovered. I mean, when I was at Princeton in the late 90s, no one knew about this collection of, I think it's 43 manuscripts, mostly of the Báb's writings, that were deposited there through the good offices of the Reverend Dr. William McKelwey Miller.
Yes.
And in connection with the research he did to refute the claims of the faith in the early 20th century. And so, large numbers of texts sometimes just, appear and are discovered in time. So there's no guarantee that even the World Center has everything, but certainly it has quite a bit more. And from that, and from the list or that one statistic that I was able to quote that came from a research department memorandum, that number of 5 million and 2,000 texts obviously is based on what's available in the international archives.
Right. If they can manage 30 years ago to find a new signature of William Shakespeare after 500 years,
yeah,
it shows you how we will be finding things. Paul says, what is that architectural structure you have a picture of that flashes by? It's
I'm
another,
not sure. Was there an architect?
it looked kind of like the arch in Tehran or something, things going up.
Gosh, I don't know. It might have just been the background.
It's one of your
My
background.
windows that's automatically cycling through.
Halim says, deep knowledge of the Quran being so important to understanding the works of the Báb, I've several times tried to read the Quran directly, but quickly became confused and overwhelmed. Do you have any recommendations on how we might approach studying the Quran? Perhaps recommended translations, commentaries, books about the Quran, or otherwise?
That's a great question. In my opinion, there isn't a single translation that just stands out head and shoulders, that is the obvious one that clarifies questions and so forth. But there are translations of the Quran that are more or less helpful because some of them include helpful explanatory footnotes. And even though those footnotes, of course, are going to represent some opinion of some, of some someone who may or may not be correct in their opinion, I still find them helpful. And so, although I've read Rodwell's translation because that's the one Shoghi Effendi used, there have been many other, wonderful translations that have come out in the decades since the Guardian's time. One of them is, I think it's called the Study Quran, that's published in part with Sayyid Hussein Nasr. There's another one by Yusuf Ali is the one that I tend to use a lot because it introduces each surah, tells you something about it. It has extensive footnotes. It has the Arabic text alongside the translation. That's kind of my go-to Quran when I want to access something. But you're right. Just diving into the Quran itself can be a daunting challenge. And what prepares you for that preparatory step? I guess I don't have a great answer except that use a translation that explains it, because as with Baha'i translations often don't have much in the way of commentary, apparatus of commentary, or you're left to your own devices, and there's a good reason for that, because you don't want a layer of commentary to send you off in a wrong direction. And so there's a good reason to keeping the text as unadorned as possible.
Right.
However, for something like the Quran, I just find it useful to pick a translation that does have commentary and footnotes.
Yeah, and some of the translations that are available really don't make it easier to understand for Westerners either. I mean, what is it? We have made spirits and men something, or which of your Lord's bounties will ye deny? And then they have you and you frequently, because it's the you and the Arabic dual, and the Guardian just uses thee or thou or you or you or something. It doesn't worry about the fact that it's an Arabic dual in there.
Yeah.
One suggestion I always heard was read the Quran back to front, because the surahs are shorter in the back, longest in the front. So start with the shorter ones and digest those first.
That's a pretty good idea, yeah.
Greg asked this question, and Greg is the person who asked the question that I already repeated, but let's see if you have a better answer. If you were to summarize, let us say, 5 to 7 of the key social teachings of the Báb to attract people in a pamphlet with bullet points similar to the 12 principles, what would they be?
I just wouldn't do that with the Báb's writings. I don't think that's what it's about. It's not about this. For me, it's not about the social teachings, but it's about the revolution, almost in the concept of what is divine revelation. I mean, the Báb was challenging the whole concept of what divine revelation is in writing what he did, in the way that he did, in the format that he did, which, if one attempts to make sense of it, sometimes one fails, because he's painting a canvas. He's not giving us lists of principles or lists of rules, but he's playing a kind of a symphony in a key that no one has heard before. And that's what he's using the words for.
If I were to attempt this, I would talk about a principle of kindness to others. That's one that's Nader singles out. A principle of beauty, which you singled out. These are the kinds of things that are as close as you can get, it seems to me.
Refinement is is definitely one of the ones that comes out the most. And just to give you an example of this, this would go on my sort of card that I hand out. It's a provisional translation, but so take it for what it's worth. He says, I counsel thee with these 3 words. Shouldst thou act in accordance therewith, all sorrow will depart from thee in this world. They are the following. Be not content with anything when once thou becomest aware that it hath a still higher degree. Be not untruthful, though thy very life hang in the balance, and act not towards others save as thou wouldst desire for thine own self. He summarizes 2 really obvious ones and one very unobvious one. So there's the golden rule in there, and there's always tell the truth. So those should be top 5. But the other one, which he starts with, is one that just endlessly fascinates me. And I think it's quite closely connected to his idea of beauty, and his idea of refinement, and his idea of everything having infinite potentiality. You know, the whole world down to the level of the atoms is suffused with this infinite potentiality, which doesn't always become manifest. And it's part of the spiritual and our spiritual responsibility in the world is to, one way to think of our spiritual responsibility in the world is to catalyze, serve as a catalyst, both for our own spiritual potentialities becoming realized, but also realizing the spiritual potentialities of everything around us, which explains why, for example, in Gate of the Heart, you know, the Báb talks about how you should build a house in the most perfect way possible. And if you don't, you know, there are consequences. You know, the walls of the house cry out for deliverance, and you know, it's in that sort of light of the idea that that not just oneself but one's immediate environment, you know, it's basically everything over which you have some sort of influence. You want to lift it up, you know, because everything is connected. You know, and this idea that we have, particularly from history of thought in the West, that the individual is this sovereign entity, like a building with high walls, you know, and we individuals in the world are like atoms, just kind of bouncing off each other. That's not the picture of the world that the Báb gives us, and that the Baha'i teachings give us. They give us a picture of this web of interconnections that ultimately renders the human individual psyche, or the individual human consciousness at the highest levels of spiritual attainment, such as what Baha'u'llah describes in the 7 Valleys. You know, the self is burned away, you know, and what remains is the light of the divine reflecting in the mirror of the heart. And that comes through also in the Báb's writings, almost as though the soul ends up becoming some mode of God's remembrance of his own self, that in one of the more challenging passages from the Báb's writings. And this has vast implications, I think, for the kind of ethical system that emerges from it. You know, an ethical system in which everything is intimately interconnected will highlight and emphasize, you know, different virtues than a system in which every individual is kind of a self-sovereign identity and fundamentally disconnected from every other individual.
Yep. Going back to the chat here, this was Judith noted not only was Tahirih an example of the Tahirih's unveiling being an example of the equality of men and women in that period of time, but also Zainab's fighting in Zanjan, and the observation of an Irish-English doctor who examined the Báb, who observed that the Bábí women had greater liberty than women in Islam.
Yes.
So clearly there was an implied something going on, even if it wasn't explicit. Let's see. Any tips tackling the Quran? I've gone over that. A particular version of the Quran you recommend? You mentioned Yusuf Ali. Is it the heart more than the mind that initially understands implications? Sue asks this.
Oh, depends on the implications. The implications of what?
Yeah.
If it's the implications of, a pendulum swinging, and the period and its relationship to the length of the pendulum, then is that something you comprehend more through the heart or through the mind? So arguably there are certain things which the mind gets before, you understand the equations. Physicists can write down the equations of quantum mechanics and solve and make predictions to 10 significant digits, but how many people intuitively understand what's going on? So there are certain areas of human endeavor where the mind is far in advance of, let's say, our intuition, to equate heart with intuition. And then there are other areas where the heart will always be far ahead of the head, and where ultimately it's the heart has its reasons, and which the mind knoweth not, and the reasons we come up with that we think are logical are really just ways ex post facto justification of what the heart has already decided. In a lot of cases, we think we're reasoning our way through something when we're really doing is justifying what we've already decided is the case.
Yeah.
That probably happens a lot more than we're willing to think.
Yeah.
In which case, the heart, and the Bábs talk so much about this, and in Nader Saidi's Gate of the Heart, that's the overarching theme of the whole volume, that there is a mode of knowledge through what he calls the eye of the inmost heart, which is the seat of the deepest intuitions of things, which ultimately trumps logical book learning, of course. The Báb is not saying here anything fundamentally different from what any of the mystics have said throughout history, that there's a faculty of knowing which ultimately is a higher faculty than the faculty of logical or discursive thought, because it's that higher faculty can see the interconnections between things. It can see the synthesis of things, whereas the logical mind is much better with the analysis of things. The logical mind is much better in pulling things apart, dissecting, understanding things in pieces, simplifying, and understanding relationships in that very, with a kind of laser focus. Whereas it's the eye of the inmost heart, and it's the intuitive faculty of the spirit, which can intuit the interconnections of things and reach into that metaphysical oneness, which I think Nader Saidi has very eloquently stated is the center of the whole thing. This is in Gate of the Heart. He says the Báb has frequently attested that his writings are neither inconsistent nor contradictory, and that statements which may appear to be contradictory assertions are actually diverse expressions of a single underlying principle that is expressed in a particular manner in accordance with the capacities of differing audiences. A careful analysis of the Báb's writings discloses that throughout the three stages, and these are the three periods of his ministry, all his writings are animated by a common fundamental principle which has multiple dimensions and forms. We may term this foremost hermeneutic concept, or concept of interpretation, the principle of metaphysical unity.
Fascinating. Bill requests that you make a comment on the misunderstanding of certain academics that the Báb called for jihad, holy war, whereas it is clear that he was diminishing it to people who expected the Mahdi or the Bahá'í to conquer out of Iran, conquer.
There's the lesser jihad and the greater jihad, and the greater jihad, I think, has always been the primary focus of the Báb's revelation. The lesser jihad is the jihad in the world. The greater jihad, which is the truly difficult enemy to confront, is the enemy of one's own self and one's own ego, and that and that jihad is the one that I think the Báb's writings largely focus on. In that sense, jihad is very central to the Báb's revelation, but it's the spiritual revolution that the Báb is inaugurating, which is the thing that we focus on. The details of what, in the early period, it seems as though the Báb was calling for a jihad in the physical realm. and this is mentioned in certain of the sources. But I'm not being a historian and not having full command of all of these historical sources. I should defer sort of detailed commentary on that to those with more knowledge and who can contextualize those statements better than I could.
My impression is exactly that. We're called upon to be mujahids, holy warriors,
Mm-hmm.
but the Guardian in the Agon translates that the true seeker. The tablet of the true seeker is the tablet of the true mujahid.
Mm-hmm.
And that shocked me when I saw that that's how Todd Lawson popped up that translation, one of his writings. And we're called upon to indeed, the main task of us as individuals is to fight that inner spiritual battle. Anyway, that was something that I had recently heard. Keenan asks, are there any Baha'i resources for learning Arabic for the purpose of studying the writings?
I did not come across any when I was studying Arabic, 20 odd years ago. And so I don't know if in the last 10 or 20 years there have been materials created specifically in a Baha'i context to learn Arabic. It ought to be done, and it would be a great service for an Arabic-speaking Baha'i to do that. What I ended up using was typical textbooks, and I was living in Haifa at the time. During part of the time I was studying Arabic, and I remember going down to the souk and getting the children's books, literally like almost the board books, and in Arabic, because the words were big and all of the vowels were there, and I could tell from the pictures what was being said if I couldn't figure it out. So that was part of my starting point was easing myself in with that sort of a thing. I certainly would have benefited greatly if there was a Baha'i resource that focused on Baha'i specific terminology. But I'm not aware. Maybe someone in the comments, if someone is listening, and they can throw it down in the comments. And
well, the World Institute has been wanting to do a course on the Arabic language and a course in the Persian language, and we've actually started talking to people, but we have not yet been able to arrange it. So if people can provide us with any ideas, we would be happy as well to hear about that. Paul says, Chad Jones has been offering 10-day study retreats where the entire Dawnbreakers is read out loud by the participants. How might you regard this as helpful for approaching the Báb's divine ministry and works?
Yeah, I know a lot about Chad's total immersion course, and I've heard, I haven't done it myself, but I've heard from people who have done it that it really is a transformative experience. And Chad knows the Dawnbreakers forwards and backwards and has evolved a bunch of study aids that help people get through difficult things, like all the names sound the same if you don't know any Persian or Arabic in particular. The names all look the same, and so the Chad's Dawnbreaker study course has ways of helping you through that. And of course, doing it in a group setting like that, in a kind of retreat setting, is just it's a fantastic thing. And I do recommend it if one has the time. It's a big time commitment. I understand there's one or two happening, maybe even more. There's at least one or two happening, I think, this summer.
Yeah, and I've even heard people saying this is so good I want to bring it home. So I've heard talk about doing one in Indiana, for example, and that sort of thing. So yeah, people are really enjoying them.
Yeah.
Carol asks, what might artists, performance, fine, literary, etc., be challenged, surprised by, or find striking about what the Báb has to say about aesthetics?
It's more, I think, implied in what the Báb says about how beauty for him is such a central theme in his revelation. I mean, beginning with the Surah of Joseph, and how both the Báb and Baha'u'llah put huge amount of emphasis on the Surah of Joseph. And one of the big, I don't know, points of the Surah of Joseph is the beauty of Joseph, which got him into trouble, with Pharaoh's, the whole story. And that, I think, is just one among many examples where the idea that truth and goodness and beauty may actually be interconnected things, may actually be different pieces of the same thing. And it's the accident of language, maybe, that we have these three different words. And so in our heads, these are three different things. And we talk about them in different ways. We even have different, I don't know, departments in our universities to talk about truth and goodness and beauty. The ancient Greeks had an intuition that truth and beauty and goodness are actually aspects of the same thing. And I think that's of great relevance to the work of an artist. The beauty that one is producing in art is not just floating sort of off by itself, unconnected with the concept of what is true and what is good. But what is beautiful is in a way also something that is deeply true. It's a continent that's submerged, and it pokes up, in three different islands in the ocean, and we name those islands truth and goodness and beauty. But if we could see under the surface of the ocean, which is just the noise of the world, and drop the ocean waters, we would see that it's all just one continent.
We'd have a unified field theory.
Yes.
Of these three. We had a web talk recently with Glenn Cotton talking about truth, beauty, and goodness also as they...
I listened to that. That's very good, yeah.
As they were relevant to education in particular.
Yeah.
Let me see. A few more have been coming in here. No, that one I've already... Well, yeah. Can you comment from your point of view on the creative and highly revolutionary nature and purpose of the Báb's writings during the time in which he lived to prepare people for Baha'u'llah?
Well, what he had to do is break through a highly crystallized, one might say encrusted way of thinking about God, about religion, about where one locates truth, how one reads a text, how one understands a text, how one gets the divine meanings out of a text. And it had reached such a point, I think, of in the culture in which the Báb was living, in which the book was still, of course, massively venerated, but the real spiritual meanings of it were impossible to descry throughout all of the man-made additions that had been assembled around it. That play of the lamp, where you have this light, and then people in their veneration for it sort of add more and more, gold plates and jewels and so forth to it until you can't see the light anymore. And that was the world into which the Báb was thrust. And so he tore that lamp off, that beautiful covering which had so much veneration attached to it, and which so many people had, devoted so much of their lives, and so much artistic beauty was associated with, how many illuminated manuscripts of commentaries and so forth. I mean, how could this beautiful stuff not be true? And the Báb implicitly and explicitly, through his revolutionizing of the use of language, I think forced people to realize that the truth can come at you in different kinds of modes than what people are expecting. The Báb is trying to relate to humanity, is trying to connect humanity with a source of light and love. And what he has to work with, just as with all the prophets of the past, with anyone else on the planet, are words. And that's what's going to be left behind, or words. The Báb is using words in such a revolutionary and radically different way than other people have used words, that it has the effect of forcing people to realize, and I think this was later codified by Baha'u'llah much more explicitly, that how one understands divine revelation has to be fundamentally in a more of a figurative kind of approach than a literal approach. You know, one can't read the Báb's writings literally. One can't sort of read it in the way that people had been reading the Quran. But people were profoundly moved by what they heard, to the extent that so many thousands of people willingly gave their lives for it. They heard something. They heard some note that was sounded in these writings, which on the face of it seemed to go against so many of the standards of the time, of what a properly constructed text should look like and what it should say and so forth. But those who had the ear to hear heard this note that was sounded in that. And part of where that leads, and where Baha'u'llah goes explicitly in the Kitab-i-Iqan, is this point that the real thing that's going on with divine revelation is that the words are symbolic of something else. You know, the words are pointers to something else. They're keys that unlock a different mode of experience. You know, and if you read their poetry, but people are reading them as prose. I mean, to use a phrase of Joseph Campbell, you know, and and everyone had basically been metaphorically in the Báb's time, we're looking at the Quran as prose, and the Báb sort of re-reveals the Quran and shows people that it's actually the poetry is what makes it special. And again, Baha'u'llah extends on this in his works that make more explicit the principle that that divine revelation has to be read through a different kind of lens, through a different kind of eye, one that sees its symbolic nature as being preeminent. Yeah, and even Jesus gives us the hint of that in his parables. You know, he'll say a parable and then he'll say, "He that hath an ear, let him hear." You know, I've told you the parable, but there's something going on here, but you need the ear to hear it. And the Báb did that so beautifully and forcefully. And that broke through, you know, it sort of tore away that lamp, you know, that had become so encrusted, to let the bare light of it shine.
Well, I don't see any other questions. One person had missed the periods, and the first one was dealing with Islam. The second one was more metaphorical, philosophical, I guess, and then the third one was legislative, if I remember what you had said. And so Beverly was asking about that.
Yeah.
And I don't see any other questions. This really has been fascinating, Steve. Very, very appreciative of your taking the time to give us your insights and to provide us with this incredible catalog of works of the Báb that are available both in the original language and the translations that are available in English. This is, I think, something that people will find immensely helpful for time into the future.
Thanks.
So thank you very much for this, and I want to thank the audience again. One person just wrote "wonderful," so we're getting that kind of thanks coming back to you as well. So I think that's pretty much it for today, and we look forward to seeing you again and again. Thanks, Steve, very much.
Thanks, everyone.